Hi, this is Adam Kirschenheiter, the Dangerous Layman, and today I'd like to talk to you about what the Church of Christ likes to call the Great Apostasy. So the Great Apostasy is a theory that says that the Christian church fell into apostasy in the first century, shortly after the death of the last apostle. In my opinion, this is one of the most fundamental tenets of the Church of Christ because many things are built around it. My next video will talk about one of the things built around it, which is patternism. Patternism only works if you believe that the church fell into a great apostasy. One thing about the great apostasy that is a problem is that there is little evidence of a great apostasy. So the idea would be that shortly after the death of the last apostle, the church, which Christ founded, totally was like a train that went off the rails wholesale, not just a little bit here and a little bit there, but they would have to assume that it went pretty much off the rails at the same time in the same way throughout the world, because we have evidence of certain doctrines that they would say are part of the apostasy that occurred, or we have evidence of in the second century, that are accepted all throughout the world, and they would say that is apostates. So the apostasy happened wholesale. One of the things that they would say, well, some might say, some actually believe in the true presence of Christ in the Eucharist, but most would not, and that would be an example of something that they would say was part of the church apostasy. Another part they would say is the idea of baptism and baptizing children, and that is a little more complex of an issue. So I would say that the church had a developing idea of baptism in children, starting with baptizing children who were sick, right? And morphed into a little bit later. Another thing that they would say is rebaptism. Rebaptism, some Church of Christ people are against the idea of rebaptism, some people are for, but we have clear evidence that the church itself was throughout the world against the idea of rebaptism, even going so far as to say people who are baptized by heretics should not be rebaptized because their baptism by a heretic was valid. There are lots of other theological points that they would say are part of the great apostasy, but there's really very little evidence. The evidence that's used for the great apostasy is usually from outliers. That is, early Christians who had opinions that were outside of the norm of the rest of the world. So maybe it was theoretical theologians like Origen. Origen had interesting ideas about several things. Maybe people like Saint Gregory of Nyssa, who had some theoretical ideas that we now, as Catholics, would say are heretical, but at the time they weren't deemed heretical, so he was actually allowed to theorize in those directions. So the great apostasy, the biggest one, so you have a few different apostasy theories. The first would be like the Church of Christ. Shortly after the death of the last apostles, I like to hyperbolically say that as they were lowering John's body into the grave, the people standing around the grave were apostatizing. So their theory of the great apostasy would be that it was right after the death of the last apostle, which doesn't seem likely. The next theory would be that the great apostasy happened at Nicaea in 325. And I find that interesting to make that theory too, because in 325, Nicaea was dealing with the divinity of Christ, something that the Church of Christ definitely agrees with. So that would not be a good time. Many people say the great apostasy happened in medieval times. After the early church fathers, the Christological councils were all good, but then after that a great apostasy occurred. But again, this is an idea with very little evidence to back it up. So tell me what you think. What do you think about the Church of Christ and the great apostasy? Do you think that the church fell into apostasy shortly after the death of the last apostle? And if so, do you have any evidence of it? This is Adam Kirschenheiter with the Dangerous Layman signing off.